So I want to start with something practical, not a concept, not a framework, an actual thing I want you to try right now. Before we get into any of the science or the story of the application, I want you to say these 2 sentences out loud. I mean it. Actually say them out loud wherever you are, even if you're driving or you're on a walk or slightly feeling ridiculous. Just say them. I want you to sentence 1. I want you to say, I used to be a leader. Sentence 2, I am a leader. Feel the difference. Not just the semantic difference, the physical difference, the slight shift in posture, the way the second sentence either actually lands in your body with a small kind of electric confirmation, or it produces a small kind of specific resistance, right? Is that true? That the first sentence doesn't require. That difference, that's not in your imagination. That's a neurological event. And it is the entire subject of today's episode.
You're listening to Too Late My Ass, the podcast that exists because someone had to say it out loud. I'm Faye Chappell, and this show is for anyone who's been quietly wondering if they missed their window. Spoiler, you didn't. Your brain is still neuroplastic, your identity is still negotiable, and your second act, it's not a consolation prize, it's the whole damn point. Let's get into it.
So welcome to Too Late My Ass. I'm Faye Chappell. This is week 2 of April's story rewrite arc, and in this week we're going somewhere that most people who do personal development know that doesn't really want to go do the work. Not because they don't know about it, but because it's more uncomfortable than talking about mindset. And it's more specific than talking about narrative. And it's more actionable than most people want their growth work to be. So we're going into something called the language trap. And by the end of this episode, we are going to be hearing your own speech differently than you did before, which is both a gift and, I'll be honest, slightly annoying, because once you hear patterns, you cannot unhear them. So you can thank me now. Consider yourself warned. So let me start with the neuroscience, because I think it's very important to establish that what we're talking about is not a word choice in the cosmetic sense, right? This is not speak positively and good things will happen. This is not that. That version of this idea is intellectually shallow, and I want nothing to do with it, basically, right? So what we're talking about is functional relationship between language and the neural architecture, right? So the relationship is much more bi-directional and much more significant than most people realize. So here's what the research says. Language isn't processed in the brain as a separate, isolated function. Something that happens over here in the language zone while the rest of the brain gets on with the real work of being human, right? Language is processed and distributed across the networks. And those networks substantially overlap with the networks involved in that whole embodied experience, the emotional processing, the self-concept, right? So what does this mean practically? When you describe an experience in language, you're not just making sounds or marks on a page that represent experience. You're actually activating those neural patterns that are functionally similar to the patterns that you activated when you lived it. So this is why good writing makes your pulse change, right? Why a well-told story makes your palms sweat. Why a tender description of loss can make you cry, even if you've never had that experience before, right? The brain is not distinguishing cleanly between the description and the thing described. Now bring that to self-description. When you describe yourself, when you introduce yourself, when you characterize your work, when you explain your history in a pitch or a conversation or your internal monologue, you are not reporting on an identity that exists independently of your language. You are, in a real functional sense, constructing that identity, or you're reinforcing it, or you're undermining it every single time. And there's a specific psychological concept that's called self-labeling theory, and it was developed by researchers building on this self-perception theories in the 60s and the 70s. And it holds that labels we apply to ourselves function as behavioral scripts. So they don't just describe who we are, they generate who we become. So they create a kind of cognitive framework that the brain then uses to organize future behavior and perception. So here's a specific mechanism so you'll understand it a little. If you label yourself X, then the brain creates this cognitive scientist called a schema, right? A mental shortcut, a template for what X behavior looks like. And then it uses that schema to filter incoming information and generate outgoing information. So things that confirm the X get noticed and amplified, and things that contradict it get minimized or explained away. So opportunities that are consistent with the X gets flagged as relevant, and opportunities that require you to operate beyond that X get really deprioritized, right? And this is extremely efficient in one sense, right? It's extremely resistant to being changed by logic or intention. That all, becomes easier. But this is why a person who decides in their head that they are now a consultant rather than an employee, but who keep using employee language in their pitches and their introductions and their professional conversations, they keep getting treated like an employee, not because they lack credibility, because they keep labeling themselves in language that activates the employee schema in everyone talks to, including ourselves, really. So let's talk about that specific damage that tense does, because this is where it gets kind of important. So your prefrontal cortex, right? The region that's most responsible for executive function, for planning, and for self-concept. It processes verb tense differently depending on whether it indicates past, present, or future. So past tense, it activates, right? What we might think of as our function in our archives, right? It's completed. It's already filled. It's available for reference, but not really deployment in the present, right? The future tense activates that projection function, right? It's what's possible. It's what's anticipated, but we're not quite there yet because it's not real. So the present tense activates the operational function. You know what? What's current, what's active, and it's available right now for use in this room, in this conversation, in this moment. So when you say, I am a strategist, your prefrontal cortex files strategic thinking under operational. That means it's currently active. It's available for deployment, right? You can go ahead. And when you used, I used to be a strategist, it files strategic thinking in the archives. It's a previous chapter and it's currently not there to offer, right? So you have to think about that. Same capability, but completely different availability in terms of classification. And that classification, that affects your behavior, yours and everyone else's. So this isn't wordplay. This is not personal branding or any of that. This is the neurological mechanism through which the story you found in last week's autopsy gets reinforced or eroded every single day in every conversation you have. And it gets eroded through specific language choices that you make without even knowing that you actually make them. So last week I mentioned these patterns briefly in the Spark newsletter. Today I want to go into all three in depth because they really deserve it, basically, because naming them is useful for you so that you can understand it. Understanding that full anatomy of each one, well, it comes from, what it's doing, what it costs, how to address it. And that's what actually changes the behavior. So let's talk about the patterns. Pattern one is the credential reach, right? The credential reach is what happens when the past becomes the primary or exclusive source of authority in your self-description. And you'll see it a lot on LinkedIn. So Stacey's going to go through that with you for IC members in week 3 of our membership this month. It's the pattern where almost every claim about your current capability is anchored in the previous one. Previous title, previous institutional affiliation, right? In my 25 years in corporate finance, I learned. Or having run a global team of 200 people, I know. or back when I was a chief operating officer. And we're all guilty of this. And you know what? LinkedIn almost forces us to do this. So it's actually forcing us to do something that doesn't really bode well for us in the long run. So now I want to be careful here because this is where the nuance matters. These are not wrong statements. Your experience is real. Your track record is genuinely relevant. The past does legitimately inform what you bring to the present, right? The credential reach is not a problem because the credentials are irrelevant. It's a problem when the credentials are the only thing you're reaching for, right? So when the present work, the current insight, the thing you know right now from the person you are right now never gets to stand on its own, right? Never gets to stand on its own. So what the credential reach does neurologically, it creates a consistent association in your own brain and everyone listening to you between your authority and a location that happened in the past. And authority lives back there. And the further back there gets, the further your authority retreats from it, right? This is why the person who left corporate 5 years ago and is doing extraordinary work in their second act can still sound less authoritative than they actually are because their language keeps anchoring authority to the time before they left rather than what they've built and now what they know, right? And the fix is not really just referencing the past. The fix is to pair past evidence with future claim, always both. So my 25 years in finance combined with my advisory work I'm doing now with the founders in growth stages means I bring something genuinely specific to this conversation. Get it? The now and the currently are really load bearing. They are the bridge between the archive and the operational. Without them, your brain and everyone else's files you under past tense. So I want you to get in the habit of finishing credential reach sentences with present tense every time without exception, because it will feel a little awkward at first, but do it anyway, because you will see all of a sudden it makes more sense with what you're talking about. So that's pattern one. Pattern two is the preemptive downgrade. And a lot of you do this on LinkedIn too. This is the one I think does the most cumulative damage, I think. And it's the one that is the most invisible because it wears costumes of virtue, let's say. It looks kind of like humility and it sounds like approachability in professional environments, particularly in the cultures that many women in the community navigated their whole careers in, right? It was explicitly rewarded, right? The preemptive downgrade was the behavior that made you easier to work with, right? It was easy. You were made easier to promote, easier for the people in power to feel comfortable around. It's the verbal move of making yourself smaller before anyone has asked you to. So words that make it sound, I'm probably missing something here, but this may be a naive question. I know you're the expert, so take this with a grain of salt, but I don't want to overstep, but I'm not sure if this is exactly relevant, but each of these phrases is doing something specific at the neurological level, right? It is creating what psychologists like to call behavioral pre-commitment, right? Before the room has assessed you, before anyone has questioned your credibility or your right to take up the space, you have publicly declared yourself to be somewhat less than full authoritative, right? You've marked yourself with an asterisk, and that brain, yours and the brain of everyone else listening, files that asterisk, right? And it shapes how what follows gets received. It shapes how you are remembered. And here's the cruel efficiency of that. The brain learns from its outputs. So every time you deploy this preemptive downgrade, you're not just affecting this conversation, you're reinforcing that, and your neural pathways are going to start producing it. You're making it more likely that the next time you walk into a room, that preemptive downgrade will be automatic, not a choice. It's just what you're going to be doing. So the phrase I want you to carry with you for this week is one that I've been using for a while now. Is this humility or is it this a habit? Because those are not the same thing. Genuine humility, the kind that is actually a virtue, the kind that I have enormous respect for, and I try to practice, but genuine humility is not expressed through pre-marking yourself as inadequate before everyone has even questioned your adequacy. It's expressed through openness to being wrong when you're wrong, through genuine curiosity about perspectives you haven't considered, through not needing to be right more than you need to be accurate. You can be all of those things without the opening qualifier, without the I'm probably missing something here, without the pre-apologizing for existing at full capacity. True humility doesn't need a disclaimer. It shows up in the behavior that follows a confident opening. So I really want you to ask yourself these things, right? Because most of us have done something like this. We might go to a talk, and I know, for example, I love going to astrophysics talks. And if I was talking to Neil deGrasse Tyson, I would probably say something like, I know this is probably a ridiculous question, but so I am doing what I'm telling you not to do. So I will be very, very clear that I'm not going to do that moving forward, because that is basically saying, I don't know what I'm talking about. I don't have to frame it that way. I don't have to do a but. I can just ask the question or feel like I'm giving a significant input without feeling like I have to downgrade myself. So pattern 3 is the transitional limbo, right? And it's the language of that permanent in-between, right? It's what happens when the identity transition that began at a specific point, like leaving corporate, launching the second act, making the pivot, never really lands in the language, even years after their transition was really done, right? So you guys have heard it, and unfortunately you've seen it on LinkedIn, and it might be like, I'm in a bit of a transition right now, or I'm figuring out what the next chapter looks like, or I'm exploring more directions, or I'm kind of in between things at the moment. And these are the phrases that are honest when you're genuinely mid-transition. But the first 6 months after a major shift, well, when things are really uncertain and in flux, after that, is it really accurate anymore? Does it describe the truth? The problem I see is that I see it constantly in people who have been in their second act for 2, 3, 4 years. If that's you watching right now, then you'll understand it. It's when this language keeps running as the primary descriptor well past the point where it's accurate. So if the transition is substantially over and the new chapter has substantially begun and the person is still introducing themselves as someone who's figuring things out, not because they're not, but because they have a habit of being in transition, because that's more comfortable than the vulnerability of having arrived. So here's how it is at work. Being in transition is a protected state. When you're in transition, you can't be held to the full potential of the new identity, right? Because the new identity hasn't officially arrived. And any gap between where you are and where you want to be is transition's fault, not yours. You're still becoming, you're still on the way. So cut you some slack. But here's what that protection looks like, or what it costs you. The brain, it organizes behavior around the identity, right? It's being holds, right? It's saying, tell it you're in transition, and it organizes the behavior accordingly, right? So not really committed to any particular direction. And it's building slowly, waiting for more information, taking time to get those bigger moves. And that's appropriate behavior for a person in transition, but completely wrong for somebody who's actually arrived, is now operating from a clear second act identity, right? So the transition ends when you decide it ends, not when someone gives you a little title, right? Not when somebody gives you a revenue number to hit. No, what you want to do is you want to accumulate enough evidence so that the new chapter is real. The transition ends when you stop using transition language to describe yourself. When you say in present tense, without qualification, this is who I am and this is what I do, that's what you need to do. So I'll get a little personal here because I think the theory is useful and the practice is essential. And the way you make something practice rather than theory is to make it specific. So let me tell you exactly what I found when I did my own language inventory, which I'll tell you is more uncomfortable than I expected. So let's talk about the credential reach. I caught myself doing this in virtually every high stakes introduction situation that I've been in for the first 2 years of my second act. And here's what made it particularly interesting. I was doing it in rooms where corporate background was generally not the most relevant thing, but I was bringing it anyway. Rooms about coaching, about reinvention work, and about specific things I was building. And still, at almost every time, the introduction reached, having spent 20 years in corporate environments, as if those 20 years were the permission slip that I needed, right? And the thing I noticed is that corporate credentials felt provable in a way that the current work did not. So if someone questioned the corporate background, I had documentation. This is what I did. Here's my track record. I had history. And if someone questioned my reinvention expertise, the thing that I was actually selling, the thing that I was actually building, I had conviction. I have lived experience, the work itself, which is actually more than enough, but which didn't come with the same institutional certification, right? That made that whole credential reach feel safe. So the moment I realized I was using corporate history as a shield, as that defense mechanism, was the moment I started being able to change it because I could see what it was doing. It was protecting me from having to stand in the present work and say, this is what I know. This is what I've built. This is what I offer. No institutional backing required. And that is way more exposure, right? But it's also more powerful because the person who says, I am this thing, right? Without trying to get some credentials in the background is way more powerful than I used to be that thing. Therefore, I know about this thing. They're claiming the thing itself, present tense, and owning authority. So, did I do any of the preemptive downgrade? Well, this one went a little deeper, and I want to be honest about where I still catch it. I catch it most often in writing, in emails, and I told you, I do it regularly in certain things, in pitches and copy. I can hear that slightly apologetic softening that spoken version of me had got substantially better at, right? It's a kind of hedging that creeps in when you're writing, like, I'm still actively working on, I think this might be, instead of, I wonder if, instead of, here's what I know, you might say, you might find this interesting, or this will. I also catch it in rooms with very specific profiles. So rooms with a lot of academic credentials, right? I don't have a traditional academic background for the field that I'm working in, obviously. I came to neuroscience and behavioral psychology through application and experience rather than formal study. And there is still sometimes a version of me that walks into an academically credited room that wants to kind of pre-flag it to say, I don't know. I know I don't have the letters after my name, so please calibrate your expectations, right? But the fact that I've read more in this field than most people with traditional credentials, the fact that I've applied it directly to hundreds of real human beings going through real reinventions, the fact that the outcomes of that application constitute a form of evidence that formal study alone doesn't really allow, all that gets temporarily overridden by the instinct to pre-apologize, okay? And I still catch it. I catch it earlier than I used to, but when I catch it, I make a different choice. But I want to be honest that making a different choice is the practice. It's not a switch that flips permanently. It's a muscle that requires ongoing use, like any muscle you use. And finally, the transition limbo. This is the one I held on to the longest, I think, because I think I understand why. Because a transition narrative is safe, right? In a specific way that goes beyond protecting me, right? From being evaluated, right? It also, in real sense, protects me, my identity. The story of someone rebuilding from a catastrophic life event is really a compelling story. It creates connection and people understand it, and it produces a kind of warmth and empathy that's straightforward positioning really sometimes doesn't. But at some point, I had to face the fact that I was using emotional resonance of the transition story as a substitute for the harder work of clearly articulating what I was actually building and why. So it was easier to say I'm building something in my second act, reinvention space, and in slightly in progress framing than it is to say I run a community for midlife professional people who are doing the identity and reinvention work that most programs really don't touch. I host a podcast that reaches thousands of people. I produce content that blends neuroscience and lived experience in a specific way. This is what I do. The second version is more specific, right? It's also more exposable, and it's more available to be evaluated on its own terms. And therefore, it's more vulnerable. And therefore, once I started using it, it became more powerful. So the transition story is real. The origin is still part of who I am, but is no longer the primary language of what I'm doing. What I'm doing now is its own thing. It has its own language, and it doesn't need the transition as a prefix. So here's the framework, 3 steps, really simple, surprisingly difficult, as always. You must do homework when you come to this podcast. So let's do the data collection, depending where you're from, in the next 48 hours. So for the next 48 hours, I want you to pay attention to every moment where you describe yourself or your work to another person in introductions and professional conversations, in emails, and if you're willing to go deeper in your own monologue, the voice in your head when you're preparing for a meeting or a call. And I want you to notice without judgment, you're not trying to catch yourself in failure. You're conducting a linguistic audit. You are the researcher. The subject also happens to be you. So I want you to write down what you find, specific phrases, sentences, patterns, the things that come out automatically before you've had a chance to think about them. Those are the most informative thing you can do. And then I want you to do step 2, and I want you to categorize what you find. So go through what you wrote down and say, which of these 3 patterns is more present? Is it the credential reach, the automatic anchoring to the past? Is it the preemptive downgrade, the pre-apologetic qualifying language? Or is it that transitional limbo where you're still in perpetual progress framing, right? Because most people have a dominant pattern, right? You could have all 3 like me, but most people have a dominant one that shows up more consistently than others. And I want you to identify yours. It's probably not a surprise, right? But you'll likely recognize it, but now you will actually see it written out. So step 3, I want you to write the alternative. For each of these specific instances that you found in step 1, I want you to write the present tense. I want you to do it accurate, unqualified alternative, not a boost, not a boast, not a I'm great. I want you to say to yourself in the present tense what it is. It's not a performance of confidence. You don't have to worry about that. It's not a performance. You heard me, right? Not a performance. It's a factual, accurate statement about who you are, what you do in present tense without no pre-apology and no credential reach, okay? So I used to be known for strategic thinking because I am a strategist. Strategic thinking is how I approach every engagement. Or I'm in a bit of a transition figuring out my next chapter becomes I'm building a consultancy focused on X, and here's what that involves. Or I'm not really an expert in this, but I found that becomes what I've found in my work is, let's give you one more. Having spent 20 years in X, I now think becomes my view on this, drawing on 20 years of experience, and the work I am doing now is. I want you to write them all. Say them out loud. Notice the resistance. The resistance is information. It tells you exactly how far the current automatic language is from the accurate description. And that is the gap, right? The gap is what language inventory is designed to make visible. And once you see it, you can close it one conversation at a time. I want to say one thing about resistance because I think it's important and I don't want you to use it as a reason to stop. When accurate self-description feels like bragging, when I'm saying I'm a strategist without qualifying the prefix, feels like overclaiming, like you need to earn the right to that sentence before you say it, that feeling is not evidence that the sentence is false. It is evidence of how long you've been underselling yourself. It's a calibration error. It's your internal sense of the right size for this sentence has been set at a smaller than accurate for so long that accurate has to come feel large. So the fix is not to think harder about whether you deserve the accurate sentence. The fix is to say the accurate sentence enough times in enough rooms with enough subsequent evidence that it doesn't produce disaster. That internal collaboration, it just starts resetting. The accurate starts to feel like a baseline. That's the formerly like too large sentence starts to feel like the truth. So describing yourself accurately is not bragging. It's not self-promotion. It's not arrogance. It's the baseline minimum requirement for showing up as a professional that you actually are. You're doing the work that you do at the level you actually operate at. It's what everyone around you who doesn't have that preemptive downgrade habit is doing as a matter of course. And it is available to you as soon as you decide to stop performing that whole diminishment thing, that whole you don't deserve it thing, right? I want to say something briefly about these three patterns that I think is particularly accurate in the midlife reinvention, because I don't think it's accidental. That whole credential reach, that preemptive downgrade, and the transitional limbo are all, in different ways, responses to a specific vulnerability that is more common in people doing their second act work. That vulnerability, the new identity, doesn't have that institutional backing yet. So if you were a vice president in a large organization and your authority partly came from, that institution, and that institution provided the frame and the title provided the shortcut, you could walk into a room and the title did some of the heavy lifting before you even spoke, right? I'm vice president. And then everyone was, he's a vice president. So in the second act, in the consultancy, in the coaching practice, in the portfolio career, in the thought leadership work, whatever you're doing, you are the institution. There is no organizational frame doing the work for you. There's no title that signals the category before you've had to earn the room, right? Which means you have the full author of your own authority in your language, in your posture, in your self-description completely, each and every time. And that is a little harder than it sounds, right? Because the three patterns we've talked about today are at the root. Strategies for managing the discomfort of that exposure, right? So reach back to that credential because the credential is provable. Pre-apologize because it's easier to be pleasantly surprised or disappointed. Stay in transition because transition is protected, right? But the second act requires you to give those strategies up and to replace them with something more direct and more vulnerable and ultimately more powerful. Present tense, accurate, unqualified self-description that really stands on its own without an institution holding you up. That is the language of the second act. That is what this week is about. It's about learning to speak. So here's your homework. If you didn't get it the first time, number 1, 48 hours, the language inventory, write down what you find, categorize it, write the alternatives, say them out loud in your car or in your kitchen or wherever you practice things that you're not quite ready to say in a room yet. And then, and this is the part that matters, start using them. Non-high stakes room immediately if it feels like it's too much, but maybe in medium stakes conversations. The professional ones where outcomes matter, but you're not betting, everything on them. So I want you to start using that present tense, the accurate, the unqualified language there, and notice what happens. Notice whether the sky falls. Notice whether people receive it exactly as you intend or whether they receive it as arrogance, which I really suspect they will not. Going from there, next week, we go into the active mechanisms of narrative change, right? So memory reconsolidation, the 5-stage story rewrite. We're going to talk about the real work of closing the chapters that need to close and writing the new ones that belong to who you actually are right now. But none of that work will stick if the daily language is still writing the old story over top it. So this week is foundational. I want you to do the inventory. And remember, every Sunday morning ritual drops, Sunday morning, 7 a.m. And it's entirely built around the language work. So it's breathwork, journaling prompts specifically for finding and rewriting your dominant patterns. It's 30 minutes or so that will give you more work with those 4 hours that you're going to spend on paper and patterns. This in 30 minutes will do more work for you than you even think. Inner Circle members, your identity autopsy masterclass is in the portal if you haven't already done it. The language work and the autopsy work are designed to do together. They're two tools for the same structural repair. And you are not a person in transition. You are a person who has transformed, who is building something, who knows things that are genuinely valuable, and who deserves to describe all of that accurately without apology. Your language should know that by now. So too late, my ass.
And that's a wrap on this one. If something landed for you today, sit with it. That's your nervous system updating its software. Let it run. And if you want to get deeper, the Long Game is our daily ritual app, 15 minutes a day, built around the move, mind, and meaning framework. It's the daily practice behind everything we talk about on this show. And you can find it at tlmalonggame.com. And if you're ready to be in the room, the Inner Circle is where we do the real work. Monthly masterclasses, identity challenges, and a community of people who are done playing small. Join us at toolatemyass.com/inner circle. Until next week, stay rebellious. I'll see you then.